Some ropes are not meant for justice. They are meant for cruelty, for a slow, baking death under a sun that offers no mercy. On a blistering July afternoon in 1876, the sky over Prescott Valley was a sheet of white-hot iron, and hanging from the cross beam of a half-finished cabin were two young women. Their bodies weren't limp, not yet. They swayed in the scorching desert wind, a grotesque pendulum marking the final agonizing seconds of their lives. They weren't hanged to die quick. They were tied to suffer, to wither until their lungs gave out and their spirits broke. The land was empty, but the silence screamed. Emily, no more than 24, her hair a tangled mess, her lips cracked and bleeding. Her arms were bound so tight the rope had sliced into her skin. Beside her, Sarah, barely 21, golden hair stuck to her sweaty face, her chest rising in tiny, ragged spasms. Their bare feet scraped the air, inches from a ground they would never touch again. This wasn't an execution. It was a message. At their feet, a charred wooden sign was stabbed into the dirt. The letters were gouged deep, then burned black. This land belongs to Carver. Strangers will perish. The sun beat down on those words, branding them into the memory of anyone who dared to pass. In this part of the West, justice wasn't a promise anymore. It was a weapon, wielded by a man named Nathaniel Carver, a judge by title, a tyrant by nature. To him, this land wasn't something to be nurtured. It was something to be owned. And people were just tools to be used, broken and discarded. These two women had names, families, lives. But to Carver, they were just warnings. Their slow, public suffering was a banner of his absolute control. No jury, no trial, no mercy. Just the slow march of death in the open sun. And the town would do nothing, because fear had long ago choked the courage out of every man, woman, and child in Prescott Valley. This is the dark truth of the West they don't tell you about. It's not the gold rushes or the endless horizons. It's the silence of good people, the surrender of an entire town to the will of one evil man. As the heat shimmered and the women's weak cries faded into the wind, the land itself seemed to hold its breath. But somewhere over the ridge, hoofbeats were approaching. One man riding toward what he thought was an inheritance. He had no idea he was riding onto a battlefield, one already stained with blood and despair. Thomas Grady had seen enough death to last 10 lifetimes. At 52, the war had carved lines into his face and left a permanent ache in his bones. But as he pulled his horse to a halt before the old cabin, the sight that greeted him stirred something cold and hard in his gut. He wasn't a hero. He'd come to this valley seeking peace, a quiet place to live out his days on the land his late brother had left him. But looking at those two women, hanging there like slaughtered animals, he knew peace was a fool's dream. They weren't strangers. They were a line drawn in the sand, and he was standing on the wrong side of it. He swung down from his horse, his boots crunching in the dust. With a single fluid motion, he drew his hunting knife and sliced through the first rope. Emily fell into his arms, a dead weight, her skin burning with fever. Her breath was shallow, a tiny flutter against his chest, but it was there. She was alive. He carried her to the shade of a lone mesquite tree, laying her down as gently as he could. Then he turned back for Sarah. She was lighter, almost weightless, as if the desert had already claimed half of her. He cut the rope and lifted her, her head lolling against his shoulder. He carried her inside the derelict cabin, the air thick with the smell of dust and neglect. He cleared a space on the floor, spread out his bedroll, and laid the women down. He uncorked his canteen, tipping a few precious drops of water onto their cracked lips. For a long moment, nothing. Then a swallow. Emily's eyes fluttered open. They were dazed, unfocused, but they saw him. Sarah stirred a moment later, her weak fingers clutching at his sleeve, as if trying to anchor herself to the world of the living. Thomas built a small fire, the flames pushing back the encroaching darkness. He sat there watching them, his hand resting on the worn stock of his Winchester. He'd come here to honor his brother, to build a life on the foundation his brother had laid. But this land wasn't a foundation. It was a tomb. When Emily finally spoke, her voice was a raw, broken whisper. She spoke of Carver, how he'd stolen her family's ranch, how he'd run her father out of the valley with nothing but shame for a blanket. Sarah's story was worse. She told of Carver's men dragging her from her home in the middle of the night, marking her as Carver's property because she'd dared to refuse his advances. She'd fought back. That's why she ended up on the rope. Thomas listened, his expression unreadable, the firelight dancing in his tired eyes. He hadn't come looking for a fight. But in the West, trouble had a way of finding you, whether you wanted it to or not. The fire popped, casting long shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the wind howled, and it sounded like it was whispering a name. Carver. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Because when a man like that owns the land, the only question is when he'll come to collect his due. Thomas sat on the porch that night, his rifle across his knees. The desert heat had finally surrendered to a cool, dry wind, but the weight on his shoulders felt heavier than a mountain. He was supposed to be done with this, done with fighting, done with watching people die. But the valley had other plans. Just after midnight, a lone rider approached, a dark silhouette against the moonlit landscape. Thomas raised his rifle, his thumb brushing the hammer. The rider raised an empty hand, a gesture of peace. As he drew closer, Thomas recognized him. Caleb, one of Carver's men, a man who, years ago, had ridden with Thomas's own brother. Caleb's face was a roadmap of regret. "You should have left them, Tom," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You cut down Carver's property. He ain't gonna forgive this. He's gonna bring hell down on this cabin." Thomas studied the man. This wasn't a threat. It was a plea, a warning from a man who had seen the devil's work up close. "My brother thought this land was different," Thomas said, his voice flat. Caleb shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "Your brother, he didn't know the whole story." He shifted in his saddle, glancing nervously back the way he came. "Look, I'm telling you this for his sake. Get on your horse, take the women, and ride. Ride till you hit the ocean. Don't look back." Before Thomas could respond, Caleb spurred his horse and disappeared back into the night, leaving only a cloud of dust and a sense of impending doom. Trouble wasn't just coming, it was already here. By sunrise, Thomas had made his choice. He wasn't running. He left the women barricaded in the cabin and rode into the dusty, sun-bleached town of Prescott. He headed straight for the sheriff's office. Sheriff Cole was an old friend, a man Thomas had served with years ago. He was a good man, or so Thomas thought. Cole listened to the story, his face grim, his fingers drumming on his desk. "It's Carver, all right," Cole sighed, leaning back in his chair. "He's had a stranglehold on this valley for years. I've tried to push back, but he's got money, men. He's got folks too scared to even look him in the eye." "But you have witnesses now," Thomas insisted. "Two women who can testify to what he did." Cole looked Thomas dead in the eye. "And who's going to protect them, Tom? Who's going to protect anyone who speaks against him? Carver strung up 3 men in the town square last year for trying to form a grange. Left them hanging for 2 days as a warning. That memory ain't faded." The sheriff's words were heavy with truth. The people of Prescott Valley were trapped in a cage of fear. "If we're gonna move against Carver," Cole said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "it can't be just us. We'll need more than badges. We'll need the people to finally stand up with us. We need proof. Something undeniable that will break his hold over them." It was a dangerous gambit, asking a town of terrified people to rise up against a tyrant. But Thomas knew Cole was right. One man, even a man as determined as Thomas Grady, couldn't fight an army alone. As Thomas left the office, a cold feeling washed over him. He was no longer just a man seeking peace. He was the spark. The question was, would he ignite a fire for freedom, or would he be snuffed out, leaving the valley in even deeper darkness? He looked at the faces of the people on the street, eyes downcast, shoulders slumped. They were ghosts in their own town. He knew then that this fight wouldn't just be for 2 women or a piece of land. It would be a fight for the very soul of Prescott Valley. Thomas returned to the cabin, the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. "We need proof." He tended to Emily and Sarah, who were slowly regaining their strength. As he gave Emily a fresh bandage for her wrist, her eyes, filled with a mixture of gratitude and terror, met his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still hoarse. But you shouldn't have. You don't know what you've done. I know exactly what I've done, Thomas replied, his voice firm. She shook her head. No, you don't. She took a ragged breath. My family owned this land. All of it. Carver wanted it, but my father wouldn't sell. So Carver sent his enforcer, a man who wasn't afraid to get his hands bloody. He beat my father half to death and made him sign the deed. Thomas felt a familiar anger rise in him. Who was he? Emily's eyes filled with tears. She hesitated, then the words tumbled out, barely audible. The man who did it. The man who put us on those ropes. His name was Grady. The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Grady, his brother. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He looked around the cabin, at the rough-hewn walls his brother had built. He'd come here to honor a memory, but that memory was now a lie, soaked in the blood of innocent people. His brother wasn't a pioneer, he was a monster, a common thug. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. Was this his inheritance? A legacy of violence and theft? Before he could process the sickening revelation, Sarah, who had been silent until now, pushed herself up on one elbow. Her eyes were cold, hard chips of ice. He wasn't just an enforcer, she said, her voice cutting through the thick, stunned silence. He was Carver's partner. The words hung in the air, each one a nail in the coffin of his brother's memory. A partner, not just a hired hand, but a willing participant in Carver's reign of terror. This land wasn't just stolen, it was the foundation of a criminal empire, built by his own flesh and blood. A wave of nausea washed over Thomas. He felt a desperate need to find something, anything, that would prove them wrong. He began to search the small cabin, his hands trembling. He tore through his brother's meager belongings, a worn-out Bible, a few tarnished medals from the war, a stack of old letters. Nothing. Then his fingers brushed against a loose floorboard beneath the cot. He pried it up. Underneath, covered in a thick layer of dust, was a small, leather-bound ledger. It was locked with a simple brass clasp. Hope, desperate and fragile, flickered within him. Maybe this held the truth. Maybe it would exonerate his brother. As he was trying to force the lock, the sound of hoofbeats thundered outside. Not one rider this time, but dozens. They were surrounded. Carver had come to collect. Thomas grabbed his Winchester, his mind racing. He looked at the two women, their faces pale with terror. He looked at the locked ledger in his hand. He had come seeking peace, but he had inherited a war, and the first battle was about to begin on his doorstep. The cabin door burst open, and Carver's men spilled into the room, guns drawn. But Thomas was ready. He had anticipated this. In the seconds before they arrived, he had pushed Emily and Sarah through a small root cellar trap door hidden under a rug. He'd told them not to make a sound, no matter what they heard. The first man through the door met the butt of Thomas's rifle. He went down hard. Thomas fired from the hip, the blast deafening in the small space. Another man crumpled to the floor, but there were too many. They swarmed him, and the world exploded into a chaos of fists and curses. He fought with the grim efficiency of a seasoned soldier, but the numbers were against him. A heavy blow to the back of his head sent him crashing to his knees. The locked ledger skittered across the floor. A booted foot stomped on his hand, and he cried out as the bones crunched. Strong hands hauled him to his feet, and he found himself staring into the cold, merciless eyes of Nathaniel Carver. Carver was not a large man, but he radiated an aura of absolute power. He was dressed in a fine black suit, looking strangely out of place amidst the dust and violence. He smiled, a thin, cruel slash across his face. "Thomas Grady," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Your brother's heir. I was so sorry to hear of his passing. A tragic accident." He gestured to the two dead men on the floor. "And now you've made a mess on my property." He picked up the ledger. "Looking for this?" He dangled it in front of Thomas. "Your brother was a meticulous man, kept records of everything, every land deal, every transaction." He tapped the cover. "He was also a fool. He thought he could double-cross me." Carver's eyes darkened. "He came to me a month ago, said he'd had a change of heart, found God, or some such nonsense. He wanted out. threatened to expose me. Carver laughed, a dry, humorless sound. I explained to him that our partnership was for life. The truth was a punch to the gut. His brother hadn't been a monster to the end. He had tried to do the right thing, and it had cost him his life. You killed him, Thomas rasped, blood trickling from his lip. As I said, a tragic accident, Carver replied smoothly. He tossed the ledger into the fireplace, and the flames leaped up, consuming the leather and the secrets within. Now, the women. Where are they? Thomas stared back, his silence a wall of defiance. Carver sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. No matter. He turned to one of his men. Burn it. Burn it all to the ground. The men began splashing kerosene on the walls, the fumes filling the small cabin. Carver gave Thomas one last look, a look of utter contempt. Your brother learned a valuable lesson, Mr. Grady. This valley belongs to me. Anyone who forgets that ends up in the ground. They dragged him outside and threw him in the dirt. As they rode away, a torch was tossed through the doorway. The cabin went up like a tinderbox, flames roaring into the twilight sky. Thomas watched, helpless, the fire consuming the last remnants of his brother's life. And, he feared, the two women he had tried to save. He lay there, his body broken, his spirit crushed, listening to the roar of the flames and the triumphant laughter of Carver's men as they disappeared into the darkness. He had lost. The valley and everyone in it belonged to Carver. The fire raged, a funeral pyre for his hopes. But as the roof of the cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks, a small, choked cough came from nearby. Thomas forced himself to turn his head. From the smoking entrance to the root cellar, Emily was crawling out, her face covered in soot, dragging a semi-conscious Sarah behind her. They were alive, battered, terrified, but alive. A single hard ember of defiance began to glow in the ashes of Thomas Grady's despair. This wasn't over. Carver had burned down a cabin. He hadn't burned the fight out of him. He had taken his brother's life and his legacy. Now Thomas would take it back. He would uncover the truth, and he would have justice. Or he would die trying. He struggled to his feet, every muscle screaming in protest. Emily rushed to his side, helping him stand. Their eyes met over the roaring flames, a silent pact forming between them. He won't get away with this, Emily said, her voice filled with a newfound steel. No, Thomas agreed, his gaze fixed on the dark ridge where Carver had vanished. He won't. They spent the night huddled in the rocks, the smoldering ruins of the cabin casting a hellish glow. By morning, Thomas knew what he had to do. The law in Prescott was a joke. The sheriff was either powerless or corrupt. If he wanted justice, he'd have to find it himself. And he knew where to start. My brother mentioned a partner, Thomas said to Emily. Carver confirmed it. But men like Carver don't have partners. They have tools. My brother must have had something on him, something to guarantee his safety. The ledger, Emily said, her face falling. It's gone. He burned a ledger, Thomas corrected. My brother was smart. He wouldn't have kept the only copy in a place so obvious. He thought back to his childhood, to the games of hide and seek he and his brother used to play. His brother always had a secret hiding place, a place no one else could find. He walked through the charred remains of the cabin. The fireplace stood like a tombstone. He ran his hands over the stones, pushing and tapping. Then he felt it, a single loose stone at the base. He pried it out. Inside the small dark cavity was a tin box. His hands shook as he opened it. It didn't contain another ledger. It contained a set of printing plates, expertly engraved, and a single folded letter addressed to him, to my brother, Tommy. He unfolded the paper. The letter was a confession. His brother explained everything. How Carver had recruited him, promising a fortune. But the fortune wasn't from land. It was from counterfeiting. Carver was flooding the territory with fake currency, buying up land and power with worthless paper. His brother had seen the evil in Carver and had wanted out. He'd created these plates as an insurance policy and hidden them. But the most chilling part came at the end. Carver found out I was going to expose him. But he didn't kill me, Tommy. He's dangerous, but he's not the real threat. The man who shot me in the back was the one man I thought I could trust. He's the one who runs this valley. His name is Sheriff Cole." The world went silent. The friendly handshake. The cautious advice. "We need proof, Tom." It was all a lie. Cole wasn't trying to help him. He was trying to find out what Thomas knew. He had sent him on a fool's errand for a deed while planning to eliminate him, just like he had eliminated his brother. Suddenly, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Sarah. Why was she, a rancher's daughter, so important to Carver? The story didn't add up. He turned to Emily, the letter trembling in his hand. "Sarah, who is she really?" Emily looked away, her expression a mix of shame and fear. Her story. Part of it was true. Carver's men did drag her from her home, but it wasn't a ranch. She took a deep breath. It was Judge Carver's house. Sarah, she's Nathaniel Carver's daughter. The betrayals were a tangled web, each one more shocking than the last. The sheriff was a murderer. His brother was a counterfeiter turned whistleblower. And one of the women he had saved was the daughter of the monster who had put her on that rope. He looked at Emily. Why would he do that to his own daughter? Emily's voice was barely a whisper. Because she was helping your brother. She was his informant. The hanging wasn't just a warning to the town. It was a punishment for her. Thomas now held the entire ugly truth in his hands. A set of plates that could bring down a criminal empire, and a letter that exposed the sheriff as a cold-blooded killer. But Cole and Carver still held all the power. They had the guns, the men, and the town locked in a grip of fear. And they had Sarah. He realized with a sickening certainty that Carver's men hadn't come to the cabin just for him. They had come for Sarah, and now Carver had her back under his control. "They'll kill her," Emily said, tears streaming down her face. "Now that he knows she's a traitor, he'll kill her." Thomas looked from the plates in his hand to the smoldering ruins of his brother's home. The quiet life he had wanted was gone forever. His brother's last words echoed in his mind. "He shot me in the back." He would not let his brother's death be in vain. "Carver has a ranch north of here," Emily said, her voice hardening with resolve. "It's like a fortress, but there's a way in. An old mining tunnel. It comes up right under the cellar of the main house." A desperate plan began to form in Thomas's mind. It was suicide. A direct assault was impossible, but a quiet infiltration, maybe. Rescue Sarah. Get the proof to someone outside of Prescott Valley, someone beyond Cole's control. Before he could speak, Emily grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "There's something else," she said, her face pale. "Something you need to know about me and Sarah." Thomas braced himself for another revelation. He couldn't imagine what could be worse than what he already knew. "We're not just friends from neighboring ranches," Emily confessed, her voice breaking. "Sarah, she's my older sister. Our father disowned her years ago when she ran off with Carver. He saw the darkness in him, but she was blinded by it. I haven't spoken to her in 5 years. Not until I saw her hanging from that rope next to me. The web wasn't just tangled. It was a knot of family, betrayal, and blood. 2 sisters torn apart by the same man, now caught in his deadly endgame. For Thomas, this was no longer about his brother's legacy or some abstract sense of justice. It was personal. He was standing with the last remnants of a shattered family, and he would not let Carver break them completely. "Show me the tunnel," Thomas said, his voice a low growl. The journey through the mining tunnel was suffocating. The air was stale and damp, the darkness absolute. Emily led the way, her hand trailing along the cold, wet rock wall. Thomas followed, his Winchester in one hand, the tin box with the plates and the letter tucked securely inside his shirt. Every scraped rock, every drip of water echoed in the oppressive silence, sounding as loud as a gunshot. After what felt like an eternity, Emily stopped. "We're here," she whispered. "The cellar should be right above us." They found the wooden supports for the cellar floor, and using Thomas's knife, managed to pry one of the boards loose. Muffled voices drifted down. One was Carver's, full of rage. The other was Sarah's, weak but defiant. "Told him everything, didn't you?" Carver snarled. "You worthless girl. You helped that counterfeiting son of a bitch. My own daughter. A traitor." The sound of a slap, sharp and brutal, echoed through the floorboards, followed by Sarah's pained cry. Thomas and Emily exchanged a look. There was no more time for stealth. With a powerful heave, Thomas slammed his shoulder against the floorboards. Wood splintered and groaned. He pushed again, and a section of the floor gave way. He pulled himself up into the dimly lit cellar, Emily right behind him. The scene in the room above was horrifying. Sarah was tied to a chair, her face bruised and bloody. Carver stood over her, his hand raised to strike again. Two of his men stood guard by the door. They hadn't heard the noise from the cellar over their own shouting. For a split second, Thomas had the element of surprise. He burst up the cellar stairs, his rifle already at his shoulder. He fired once. One of the guards dropped without a sound. The other guard turned, fumbling for his pistol, but Emily was a blur of motion. She grabbed a heavy wine bottle from a rack and smashed it over the man's head. He crumpled to the ground. Carver spun around, his face a mask of shock and fury. He drew his pistol, but he wasn't aiming at Thomas. He was aiming at Sarah. "You were always a disappointment," he screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a new voice cut through the tension, calm and authoritative. "It's over, Nathaniel." Sheriff Cole stood in the doorway, his own revolver drawn and leveled at Carver. His face was a placid mask, trying to project an aura of control, of a lawman arriving just in time to save the day. He was playing his part. It was a three-way standoff. Carver, his gun on his own daughter, Cole, his gun on Carver, and Thomas, his rifle trained on the sheriff. The air crackled with tension. Cole was trying to salvage the situation, to eliminate Carver and re-establish himself as the hero. He could kill Carver, claim he was rescuing Sarah, and then deal with Thomas later. No one would be the wiser, but Carver just laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. "You think you can arrest me, you backstabbing snake?" he sneered at Cole. "You're dirtier than I am. Tell him, Sheriff. Tell Grady who really put a bullet in his brother's back." Cole's composure finally cracked. His face went pale. "Shut your mouth, Carver." "Or what? You'll shoot me?" Carver's eyes were wild. "This town knows what I am, but they think you're a saint, the good Sheriff Cole, the man who protects them. But you're just a killer, hiding behind a tin star." Outside, drawn by the gunshots, the townsfolk had started to gather. They crept closer to the ranch house, their fear momentarily overcome by a morbid curiosity. They heard Carver's words, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. The seeds of doubt, planted for years, were finally starting to sprout. Carver saw his chance. He could take Cole down with him. He shifted his aim from Sarah to the sheriff, but he never pulled the trigger. A deafening blast filled the room, but it wasn't from Thomas's rifle or Cole's revolver. It was from the pistol that had belonged to the guard Emily had taken down. She now held it in both hands, smoke curling from the barrel. Nathaniel Carver stared down at the blossoming red stain on his chest, a look of pure disbelief on his face. He stumbled backward, tripped over the chair, and fell to the floor, dead. For a heartbeat, everyone was frozen. Then Sheriff Cole saw his opportunity. His only remaining threat was Thomas. He spun, bringing his gun to bear. But Thomas was faster. He fired the Winchester from his hip. The shot tore through Cole's gun hand, sending his revolver clattering across the floor. Cole clutched his bleeding hand, his face contorted in pain and panic. He looked at Thomas, then at the stunned faces of the townspeople peering through the windows in the open door. He saw no allies, no escape. He made a desperate run for the back of the house. Thomas let him go. He didn't need to chase him. The spell was broken. The townspeople, who had lived in fear for so long, had heard the truth. They had seen the sheriff for what he was. A low growl started in the crowd, a collective anger that had been simmering for years now boiling over. A group of ranchers and farmers broke away from the crowd. Their faces were grim, their eyes hard. They weren't a posse. They were a hunting party. They followed Cole out into the darkness. They didn't bring him back. Justice in the West isn't always served in a courtroom. Sometimes it's delivered on the end of a rope, under a pale desert moon. Inside the house, Thomas cut Sarah free. The two sisters, Emily and Sarah, clung to each other, weeping for their father, for their lost years, for the bloody end to their nightmare. Thomas stepped back, giving them their moment. He picked up the tin box containing the plates and the letter. It was over. The valley was free. Weeks later, the federal marshals finally arrived. Armed with the counterfeiting plates and Thomas's testimony, they dismantled what was left of Carver's operation. Thomas's brother was officially cleared, his name remembered not as a criminal, but as a man who tried to stop a great evil and paid the ultimate price. His legacy was restored. Sarah, once she had recovered, decided she couldn't stay. The ranch held too many ghosts. With a tearful farewell to her sister, she left the valley determined to find a new life, a new beginning somewhere far away. But Emily stayed. The land was hers again, bought and paid for in blood and tears. Thomas stood with her on the porch of her family's ranch house, the same porch her father had been thrown from. The air was clean. The silence was no longer filled with fear, but with peace. They looked out at the valley, a valley they had bled for. In the crucible of violence and betrayal, they had forged something new. Not a wild, passionate romance, but something quieter, stronger. A bond built on shared survival, on mutual respect, on the steady, enduring foundation of two people who had faced the darkness and chosen to stand in the light. The quiet days that followed felt like a gift. Thomas helped Emily rebuild. They repaired fences, replanted the garden, and slowly, painstakingly, erased the scars Carver had left on the land. They didn't talk much about the future. They just lived one day at a time, finding a simple, profound comfort in each other's presence. They had both lost their families, but here, in the ashes, they were building a new one. Stories like this, they're about more than just gunfights and stolen land. They're about the choices we make when everything seems lost. The choice to cut a rope, the choice to trust a stranger, the choice to fight back when fear is screaming at you to run. It reminds us that even in the darkest corners of the world, one single act of courage can be enough to light a fire that no tyrant can ever extinguish. Now I have to ask you, what would you have done? If you found that letter from your dead brother, would you have ridden into the lion's den alone? And what about Emily? Was pulling that trigger an act of justice or an act of revenge? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe stories of courage and the hard-won battles of the West deserve to be told, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. Because there are a lot more shadows out here than you think, and together we're going to drag them all into the light.